Hi, this is my PowerPoint on the evolution of special education. Dorothea Dix was born in 1802. Dix was a remarkable woman who had started 2 schools for girls by the time she was 20. Just before her 40th birthday in 1841, she visited an institution for mentally insane individuals, and she found that they were being held side by side with prisoners who were criminals, as well as prostitutes, in horrible, deplorable conditions, and she fought against that. At a time when women did not have rights. She couldn't even speak to Congress. She had to get a man to do that for her. So she was quite outstanding. And she started a crusade to better the lives of the mentally insane. Thomas Gallaudet was a pastor. He had a lot of education, but he didn't have very good health. He had to move back home to live with his parents after he had accomplished all of his schooling. And they had a neighbor who was a doctor who had a daughter who was deaf. And Gallaudet took upon himself to educate this deaf daughter. He found it to be more difficult than he had originally thought it would be. And he gathered together families that had a deaf child and wanted to teach them. This took him to Europe for education, and when he returned, he came with Laurent Clerc, and they began the the American School for the Deaf in 1817. In 1876, the American Association on Mental Retardation was established. Now this association, this institution, the name was changed 5 times. Originally it was called the Association of Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons. So if you can imagine through the years, the reasons that name changed 5 times was kind of to reflect the opinions and knowledge that was prevalent in society at the time. The American Association on Mental Retardation was established in 1876. Now, the name for this institution has changed 5 times through the years. Originally, it was called the Association of Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons. Now, if you can imagine, as non-PC as that name sounds, what the different names were throughout the years, but it kind of reflected the opinions and the knowledge that was prevalent at the time of the name changes. Their belief was that people with mental deficiencies could be cured given the proper education. So up to the point of 1879, there were institutions which taught the blind. However, it was up to them, to each institution, to develop their own materials, anything with raised print, and that was very expensive. So in 1879, the Act to Promote the Education of the Blind established the American Printing House. And this was a centralized location where all of the materials would be developed for the education for the blind, and they were able to pool their resources this way and save. Elizabeth Farrell in 1899 pulled 19 students from different levels and taught the very first special education class. Apparently she had some very modern views on special education. The Council for Exceptional Children was established at a summer session of Columbia University Teachers College in 1922. Elizabeth Farrell served as founder and president, and this was a group that was able to establish some professional teaching standards for special education. The Supreme Court in 1954 ruled that segregation violated the 14th Amendment. The landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education ended segregation in public schools. However, it did take years for this to catch on. The climate of society at that time was not ready for this change, so it did take quite a while. The Training of Professional Personnel Act was passed in 1959. This was federal legislation which provided training for teachers and educators of students with mental retardation. The Learning Disabilities Association of America was established in 1963. During a conference in Chicago, parents and educators got together and they developed some educational practices for students who had learning disabilities. In fact, Dr. Samuel Kirk was the one that during this conference coined the term learning disabilities. In 1964, education in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act was passed. This was to protect people from discrimination or exclusion in programs receiving federal financial aid. President Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. This provided funding for state-operated schools that taught children with disabilities. In 1966, just 1 year later, the same act is amended to include children from ages 3 to 21, as well as providing funding at the local level. The Equal Protection for Students with Disabilities Act was passed in 1972. Two important Supreme Court decisions established that students with disabilities have or should have equal right to access education. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, prohibits discrimination in programs run by federal agencies. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974 gave parents the right to access all school records and information regarding their child. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 mandated that all school districts have the responsibility to educate students with disabilities. In 1983, President Reagan delivered a public address entitled A Nation at Risk. Reagan aired his concerns for public education and provided a plan for improvement, including revisions in the areas of content, standards and expectations, time, teaching, leadership, and financial support. The Handicapped Children's Protection Act is passed in 1986. This provided free appropriate education extending to 3 to 5-year-old children with disabilities, and also provided early intervention for birth to age 2-year-old children with disabilities. Further, it provided families with individualized family service plans. President Bush enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, and it was passed by Congress. This was a pretty comprehensive bill which not only protected people with disabilities against discrimination based on race, religion, sex, national origin, and more, but also prohibited discrimination in employment, public service, public accommodations, and telecommunications. The No Child Left Behind Act, signed by George W. Bush in 2001, has become highly controversial. The main criticisms are that it's unjust to hold teachers responsible for unmotivated students. The intense testing takes weeks to prepare and execute, stressing out both teachers and students. And I've even heard it said that rather than making all students proficient, this bill has made all students mediocre. President George Walker Bush established the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education in 2001. The President wanted to focus on results rather than having special education teachers get bogged down with the details or the process of placement for children in special education. Also, they wanted to make sure that children with special needs were considered for general education placement first. President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. This was a stimulus package approved by Congress which provided money for education. In 2009, Forest Grove School District versus TA was a landmark court case decided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the parents of TA, a child who had disabilities but was not recognized by the school district. This case set a precedence that the school district can be sued if they fail to provide a free, appropriate public education, and that a school district may have to pay for private schooling of that child. In 2010, President Obama signed Rosa's Law. Rosa's Law, named for Rosa Marcelino, is a bill that was passed because Rosa and her family worked together to get the references in federal law changed from the wording mental retardation to intellectual disability. The push for educational reform has often been redundant and politically driven, but despite the setbacks and misguided attempts at progress, these milestones have paved the way for future improvements. The push for educational reform has often been redundant and politically driven, but despite the setbacks and misguided attempts at progress, these milestones have paved the way for future improvements. The new education model flips the classroom by using the technology of video on demand. Students are able to listen to their lectures at home and then return to school, where they do their schoolwork under the guidance of their teacher, who is now their facilitator. This allows each student to go at their own pace, and the teacher receives feedback in real time. This also frees up so much of the teacher's time that special education in the mainstream classroom is much more manageable. On top of that, mastery learning is doable. Students aren't forced to go on to the next unit when they've only received a 93 or a 75 on a test. They can continue working on something until they've got 100%. Now, this wasn't my idea, and it also isn't Sal Khan's idea, Sal Khan of Khan Academy. But he does provide educational videos that are free on YouTube. And some schools are actually using this now to flip the classroom. Schools are often criticized for not offering enough career education, and I think this is especially true for special education students. One of the articles I read talked about how they did kind of a little lesson on entrepreneurship for special education students. They took them to the grocery store and helped them to purchase sandwich ingredients, and then helped them to assemble sandwiches and wrap them. They then took them to a business, like an office building, and helped them to sell these sandwiches, and then they kind of went over and reviewed with them what to do. I think this was really a neat opportunity for them, because how many of these students will actually go on to further education? Not very many. But it's important for them to get real-life experiences. Helping them with things like resumes and job applications and interview skills can make a huge difference in their life. Simulation games are already used by NASA and the military in their training programs. Why not use it in education? I have studied this for a long time, and I found out that these games are already being used in education. Knights of Honor, Roller Coaster Tycoon, and The Sims 3 are games that you can get right off the shelf, and some classrooms are already using this to teach children. I think this is really a great idea because it sparks their interest naturally. They already like games. But in the classroom, this can be used to teach them math, science, language, and more. That without even modifying the game. Now, there are modifications that can be made to the game, and wouldn't that be cool if the students could make modifications to make things like career simulators or more lesson simulators? That would be really awesome, because not only are they learning a lesson about what they're studying and making the module do, but they're also learning technology in the process. In conclusion, I believe the future of special education is blending seamlessly students with learning disabilities into the mainstream classroom using these three models: the flipped classroom, hands-on career training, and simulation games.